I will get our work session started February 11th, 2020 on prevailing wage, redevelopment contract provisions, and human trafficking prevention work. And I'll pass it on to our city manager, Rodriguez. Oh, and I wanted to make a note. Councilmember Garcia will not be attending today.
Thank you, Mayor. Exec Analyst Martinez has done a lot of research on this issue, and it was tough because the research is inconclusive, but she has put together a lot of options for you to consider tonight. She's worked with Director Asher and Stark and City Attorney Teachin, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Tonight, what we would like from Council is just direction on those options, whether you want us to go ahead and implement them, eliminate them from consideration, or give us direction to continue to research. And Blanca has asked me to say, if you have questions, please interrupt her as she makes her presentation, and then also for the directors and City Attorney Teachin to chime in when they feel it's needed. Thank you. Blanca?
Thank you, City Manager, Mayor, Council members. Again, as mentioned, a lot of this research is inconclusive in some parts, and I'll start by just reviewing what we're going to be discussing. Again, prevailing wage, redevelopment, contract provision, human trafficking prevention. Prevailing wage, I'll start by stating, again, in terms of the federal mandate, the Davis-Bacon and Related Act was enacted first a long time ago in the 1800s, but more recently in the 1970s. It was a way to support laborers and protect employees. Thank you. So any construction projects excess of $2,000, laborers are paid a prevailing wage and that receive federal funding. In Minnesota, there's also a statute 177 to 17.44, which mandates that any laborers, any employees that are working on any project that receives state funding should be receiving prevailing wage. In the years 2019 to 2020, that was estimated at a basic rate of $36 with a fringe rate of 21.24 and a total of $57.90. And some background, and I'll ask Director Asher to please chime in as she sees fit, but the City of Richfield did some preliminary research by contacting around 43 municipalities and cities and public officials just to have a discussion as to their prevailing wage and whether they have that as an ordinance or an operating policy. And this was done in 2016. Some of the research that they found was that some of the cities did not see any differences in the bid, and in addition, some of them were reconsidering at that point whether to increase the threshold because of the paperwork and the tracking burden for the staff. Would you like to add anything on that?
No.
Okay. So, as we mentioned before, there is a lot of variations on the research. There is research that obviously favors a certain perspective. These are just some highlights. And in general, for example, in 2015, the Office of the Legislative Auditor here in the state of Minnesota stating that the prevailing wage laws result in a modest improvement in the wages of construction workers throughout the industry, and again, more significant increase in the fringe benefits. However, it is the case that the public construction cost, that area is not very clear. In addition, just 3 years ago, there was an examination, a study called an examination of Minnesota's prevailing wage laws that studied more than 2,000 bids. And it stated that prevailing wage does not reduce the bid competition. In another study that was done in California, that pointed to the effect, it was called the effect of prevailing wage regulations on contractor bid participation and behavior. They looked and they talked to about 540 contractors and subcontractors on 140 projects. And what they found that out of those 140 projects, 122 were using prevailing wage, and they found no evidence to support that the absence of prevailing wage attracted more bidders. In addition, there is another study, which I already mentioned, in which 72% of peer-reviewed studies find that there's no effect on the cost of public construction projects. On the other hand, there are some other studies that were done. For example, the one that used the stochastic frontier regression, which stated that in the first stages of the construction project, the costs were less cost effective, the project was less cost effective, but in the duration 17 months later, the cost evened out. There was another and one final study that I will mention is on rural projects, which stated that some of the construction costs increased by 23% and in some cases up to 30%. So again, the research is pretty inconclusive, and one thing to also mention is that it is important to, when looking at these studies and at this research, to make sure that the data that is being used is controlling for similar costs, because sometimes they could be comparing private and public projects, and that's not a fair comparison in costs. And also, for example, there are some studies that are also looking at the impact on the safety of the employees, which found that there is a direct correlation in projects that use prevailing wage that they do increase the safety of, especially of the general laborers. And the next slide looks at different examples of prevailing wage ordinances. Again, most of the research that I found was very specific to the state mandate and the federal mandate, but there's not a lot of research and findings as to how local municipalities enforce and track prevailing wage. And these are some of the local cities that do use prevailing wage, and this might be placed in their contract. It might be part of an operational policy, but it's not necessarily one that is, it may not be one that is enforced. There are cities like the city of Minneapolis that does have a whole office dedicated to the tracking and the enforcement, and that's because they have that capacity to do that. This is an example of Maplewood and how they have operationalized their prevailing wage, in which it goes into the city policy, the definition, hours of labor. And again, a lot of these ordinances and operating policy do mirror the state policy. And when having conversations around prevailing wage, some of the primary compliance concerns around contractors and subcontractors are these, that sometimes they can understate the hours by employees, meaning that instead of putting down that an employee worked 13 hours, they'll say they worked a regular 8 hours. Again, contractors can refuse to pay the fringe benefits. The fringe benefits can include pension and health benefits, which are really important, and sometimes they just will pay the base rate. And something that has been seen as the misclassification of employees. Again, the prevailing wage, as stated by the state mandate, it depends on where that classification is. Obviously, somebody, a carpenter is going to be paid at a different rate than some of the general laborers, and that misclassification sometimes can happen as subcontractors or general contractors could misclassify employees to lower the cost. Another compliance concern is the failure to pay the correct overtime work. Again, there's a different pay rate that happens once the laborers go overtime, and sometimes the contractor or subcontractor may just pay at that base rate. And here I wrote out some of the enforcement and monitoring practices that are used by the Department of Labor, but also are used when general contractors or contractors are enforcing the state prevailing wage law. So one of those enforcement and monitorings is the certified payroll records. Those are done weekly or bi-weekly, and what they include, they have a certain amount of information that is included in that process. For example, each construction worker, the job classification, and the rate of pay. So with that certified payroll record then is taken, and you look at what is the pay, the prevailing wage pay, and make sure that in comparison they are being paid at their classification rate and for the amount of hours that they worked. The second is on-site interviews. Sometimes the on-site interviews can happen twice during the construction project. Again, it depends on the size of the construction project. And this is literally somebody who goes out to the construction project and randomly asks laborers what they're being paid, how many hours have they worked that day, and also what is their classification. One recommendation that I have that I saw from the literature is that sometimes the general laborers are missed because they can have, they may not be English proficient, so it is important that when enforcing that there is someone that can speak the language of some of the general contractors. Another one is an inspector check-in or a daily journal of construction activity, and that is really a summation of all of these different aspects of they can keep track of the certified payroll records, they can do on-site interviews, or in general create this journal that simply states what they see. Are they seeing some of the same workers come back to the construction site? Are they seeing big changes on staff? How many hours are people generally working? So this is more of the day-to-day activity that is tracked. I also talked to two general contractors just in terms to get their input as to how they enforce prevailing wage from the state mandate. What they stated is that it doesn't necessarily impact their willingness to bid on a project. However, they did make the statement that it may increase or impact the total construction cost because of that enforcement of certified payroll and all of the other monitoring practices that they have to take on. They did talk about it improves the quality of life of the local construction workers. Obviously, they did speak to that it does make a difference for them. And one interesting aspect that they stated is some contractors and subcontractors already provide prevailing wage. So even without it being a city, state, or federal mandate, they already do it. So especially with the workforce shortage that we're experiencing right now in construction workers. And one other thing that they mentioned is that they don't have as much experience in enforcing city prevailing wage ordinances or policies, but they believe that it wouldn't be any different from enforcing the state and the federal mandate. In addition, I was asking what are some of the average costs? What does it take to do this enforcement and monitoring? They said it really depends on the size of the construction, but they gave me this very, very, this ballpark, and that is estimating not only the inspector or maybe HR who would be processing some of the certified payrolls on a weekly basis. And this is, again, very much a ballpark as to what would be the additional weekly expenses. So what are the recommendations? The cost, I believe it really, unfortunately, with the inconsistent and inconclusive research, it's hard to know what the administrative cost would be of enforcing. I do believe that the original recommendation by Director Asher was very modest, starting at $300,000 as a threshold for projects. And the reason why I believe that this could be a great way to start is that we can, as we begin to enforce it, we can either go down or we can go up depending on that. But something that is very unclear is how some of the cities are really enforcing and monitoring prevailing wage, and it's important that if we are going to go ahead with this process, we need to make sure that there's actually a way to implement it and enforce it and monitor it as to not to do a disservice to the workers. And this is another, are there any questions? Yeah.
Councilmember Whalen.
Just to clarify, I think I'm understanding correctly, because in looking at this ahead of time, the 300,000 is, I know there was the comment from Hastings about wanting to raise theirs, but in terms of the examples of existing policies, 300,000 is like 3 times higher than any of the other ones. So is our reasoning to go that high, at least to start, simply because of the unknowns around implementation and enforcement, that we wouldn't want to suddenly have 20 projects we need to figure this out on?
Right, Mayor, Councilmember Whalen, that's right. It was kind of just a ballpark starting point that we felt comfortable. I mean, it still impacted a lot of projects. Our liquor store remodels at the time, we were having a water tower painted. I listed in the memo to Steve was, there was about 5 projects that we had at the time that it would have impacted at that 300,000.
Okay.
It wasn't going to be every contract that we had. It was just a good handful of starting point. There's not much more thought behind that other than just what we learned was very limited. We only had so many responses from our inquiry.
City Manager Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a general question and then a specific answer for you. Would it be easier to, because these are different recommendations, to take them and have the discussion right after the recommendation? Okay. So, good question. When we did our research to figure out what the other cities were doing with the lower thresholds, we didn't feel like they were really enforcing them, and we would like to enforce them. And because the way we do it now is with the big construction contracts, when they're state or federally funded, when we contract for that work, it's the contractor that's doing it. So we're outsourcing that enforcement. We are not going to be able to do that, or we will need to do that if we are managing those projects in-house, because we're not going to be able to have the staff to have the expertise. We're not going to have one staff person that's going to have enough projects to enforce, and it doesn't make sense for each of the departments to relearn it each time they're managing a project in-house. So we'll have to outsource that. I would also recommend starting at 300,000. You can always go up, because we cannot give you a good estimate of how much this is going to cost both for enforcement, but also in terms of the bids, how much more that's going to be for each project. So starting at 300,000, it's still a significant amount, and it's more than we're doing now for projects that are not federally or state funded, but we will start to get some experience on that and bring that back to you to reevaluate.
Other questions? Councilmember Whalen.
And then it seems like there was some different, would this be just fully publicly funded projects that this would apply to, or is this any project over that amount in the city limits? Or what is recommended or best practice?
It would be city-funded projects.
Does that include, like, if the city is doing like a land write-down for a development or a TIF district for a development? No, okay.
I had a couple questions. So it sounds like some of the cities in Minnesota are not enforcing it, like they have shared they're not enforcing it, or it sounds like they're not enforcing it. What does that look like?
Mayor, yeah, it's not very clear as to how it is enforced. It's not very clear in their operating policy. And when I did ask some of the cities, some of them hadn't revisited this ordinance or didn't necessarily know the answer of hand and stated that they don't have, it's something that they put in their contract. It's not necessarily something that they might be tracking directly.
So I remember a similar conversation to this when we did the tenant protection, when we passed the tenant protection ordinance and we reviewed it, about enforcement being difficult because we didn't have a point of sale inspection process. And so the approach was to communicate with all of the landlords and do the best possible to follow up when we hear of sales. But I remember there being conversation that there would be kind of additional legal protections for the tenants, I believe, if it was found that their landlord didn't abide by that ordinance. Is there protections, legal protections, that would be put in place because even if there's not enforcement or strong enforcement, because this is in place, if this gets put in place?
Mayor, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that if you were to do this by ordinance, so that it's a legislative action and it's on the books, there's an expectation that contractors will have notice of this and there's a requirement to comply. And so if you're assuming that people are complying with the law, that would mean that theoretically there would be additional legal protections in place. It's just if there is, not enough, if there aren't enough resources to competently enforce the law, that just becomes a different issue.
Right.
But yeah,
Okay.
there would be having that on the books. Theoretically, there would be.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Troutman.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a follow-up question. I know that the state and the federal level, when resources for enforcement have been thinner, they've created attorney's fees provision for individuals that would seek a civil remedy. And this is, I don't necessarily need like an off-the-cuff answer if it takes more time to study, but would it be feasible to create an enforcement provision where it incentivizes private attorneys to enforce violations, and then the attorney gets the fees for enforcing a wage violation, and that way the administrative burden doesn't fall on the government, but it creates a tremendous incentive not only to correct but also to not fight a wage violation, because they know, the longer I fight, the bigger the plaintiff's attorney's fees are going to be. So things like the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, other acts, created an incentive, because you could have, for example, a violation of a creditor calling at an odd hour. Like, well, what's that worth? Oh, well, that's like $300 worth of damages. Well, nobody's ever going to sue over that. But if you have an attorney's fee provision that says it's $300 plus every minute of that attorney's time, that just changed that industry almost overnight and brought a lot of compliance. So I just wonder how feasible something like that might be for the city to look at, to just give some teeth, but also remove from us that heavy burden of compliance.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an off-the-cuff answer for
Totally,
that.
I just wanted to put it
It's
out there.
certainly something we can look into, whether that could be done at the local level. Typically, attorney's fees provisions are done via contract, although clearly there are some laws, that provide for attorney's fees. So I'm not aware if that's a typical provision or not with these kinds of ordinances.
Another context would be tenants' rights, where sometimes it's hard to same policy concern, enforceability, and that's another space where attorneys can sometimes, not sometimes, statutorily get fees that incentivizes compliance in a way that the state doesn't have to. So yeah, thank you, and I also don't expect a response, just wanted to share that.
Okay.
Do you have a question? Councilmember Supple.
I wanted to follow up as well. I do think that having that ordinance does help, even if we're not the sole enforcers, because people know what the rules are, so people can stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves. So it's kind of a dual purpose to it. Because if there's no prevailing wage ordinance there, then there's no standard. At least this sets the standard for what people should be pushing for, and so I think it's healthy to get something in place.
I had another question. So is there any difference on the administrative burden on behalf of the city if we work with somebody that already has instituted prevailing wage in their contract versus somebody who hasn't and would have to? It's the same, is it the same processing and fees and burden on our end? Or no?
Mayor, to clarify, are you saying that the administrative fees for the city versus some that may already be, like the contractors who already have prevailing wage?
Is there any is there any difference?
Well, what I saw in the research is, and from the general contractor, is that if one of the subcontractors may already provide prevailing wage, but not all of them, so we would still have to enforce the other subcontractors, the prevailing wage for the other subcontractors in the totality of the project.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Councilmember Willen?
I get that part of the uncertainty is we just can't quantify it. Are we talking like expecting to need an extra staff person to do this, or just that projects would have higher costs? Or I guess, can we attempt to quantify what the higher cost might look like?
So at $300,000, it would not be practical to have another staff person to do it. There's not sufficient work for them for non-state and non-federal funded projects. And like I said, because the departments manage the in-house projects themselves, then there won't be the expertise among the staffs in like relearning it for a project. It's just not practical. It would make more sense to outsource it to folks that are experienced in that.
Councilmember Troutman?
Just so I understand, is that outsourcing just the compliance piece, or would we be shifting our in-house contract management to just have like a general contractor for these projects?
I think that's going to depend on the project. You may have it already the way we've outsourced the management of the project, and this would just be included in it. But I don't know if Kristen has more information on that, or John.
Well, Mayor and council members, I was just going to offer that, to me, it would just be the compliance with our projects like Lindale and major reconstructions, even water tower painting. We do have consultants that manage that work that would have provided those compliance on our major projects. So we're talking about, and that's kind of the other reason probably for the 300, because we were assuming we would be doing and making sure and enforcing the prevailing wage, and we didn't know what that meant staff-wise. So, and we're not experts, but it can't be that complicated, and so maybe, but outsourcing it, I can't even believe it would be all that expensive. You're just looking for somebody to come out, do the interviews, do the paperwork. And you spoke with one of our consultants, correct? Did you get a feel for how much time that was added per, like a project like Lindale?
Yes, so they said around 10 to 20 hours a week.
Oh, okay. So that's more than I would have guessed.
Other questions? So how would you like to do this? Do we go to the next topic and then you come back and get kind of direction from us, or you want to get direction now from us? What would you prefer?
Mayor, council members, I think if we can get directions at the end. I do have a last slide that asks for next steps and
Excellent.
recommendations.
Okay.
So the next provision that we were looking at a couple of options like lien waivers and clawbacks, but it did seem that the redevelopment contract provision was one of the more practical options, and I'm gonna let Director Stark actually review some of the process.
Thank you, Blanca. So we asked ourselves the question, what if we're funding, and by we, I typically would mean the HRA, but it could be the city as well. What if we're funding a private project or helping to fund a private project through subsidies, and they aren't following labor laws like they ought to be? What kinds of controls would we have over that? So we talked with our legal team, both Mary Teachin and Julie Eddington, the HRA legal counsel, about that. Asked them if they knew of any other communities that were discussing this and what they had done about it. We only know of 2 communities, and that's Roseville and Rochester. I'm sure there are others, but those are the only ones we're familiar with. And how they addressed it was by writing something into the development agreement stating that a developer is compelled to comply with all federal, state, and local labor laws, a requirement that the developer provide documentation of proper payment to all contractors, subcontractors, and project laborers prior to the issuance of a certificate of compliance. And kind of in that, too, is that we would know who those folks are. We'd get a notification of here's all the contractors, subcontractors, perhaps even suppliers, and other folks working on the site. And then this is where the rubber hits the road. An acknowledgement that a failure to comply with those points would result in a default of the development agreement and could result in a penalty, such as non-issuance of a TIF note, or if the TIF note has already been issued, delaying, reducing, or ceasing TIF note payments. I don't know if any folks have heard the term clawback provision. That could be the case too, that for the increment we've already given you, we would take it back. I think that part of it would be impractical. And the reason for that is, once a project, let's say, take the Chamberlain, there's going to be some point in the next few months where they're going to come to us and say, okay, we've got this, lengthy development agreement with the HRA. We feel like we've complied with everything. You've complied with everything. And so you, the HRA, would now issue a certificate of completion and saying that this contract is done. Because a contract is recorded against the title for a property until that certificate of completion is done, and then the contract is taken off the property. I would think, for a TIF district, just the way they work, like the Chamberlain, they're not getting any increment yet, I don't believe, or if they are, it's just starting to trickle in now. So there wouldn't be much to claw back, is my point. So really it would be something like, I won't use them, but some project is underway. We find out that they violated something in here and say, due to this violation, you're in default of the development agreement. Really, I think what would end up happening at that point, from a, again, practical standpoint, is more of a negotiation with the developer to say, we can find you in default, we can, and if you're in default, we're not compelled to provide you with TIF or any of these things. But I would imagine that there'd be some proportionality that, let's just say that the violation is the contractor's 17-year-old son was helping to do some landscaping. Well, yeah, that's a violation of a labor law. again, proportionality, would you withhold $3 million worth of tax increment because of that? Probably not. And so that's, I think, what would get into more of a negotiation then with the developer to say, here's what we know of that you failed to meet, and we, the HRA, or whatever body is in the development agreement, think that the proper remedy, in consultation with the attorneys, would be for this to happen. And I think it would be very case by case.
Councilmember Troutman?
This is the last time I'll mention it, but I'll say this again is where when you have an attorney's fees provision, it can motivate people to settle quickly, and be nice for Kenny and Graven too. But that could be when people know there's that, it can strengthen our hand negotiation wise. So I'll just put that out there.
And I mentioned that Rochester and Roseville have this. Both of those are very new that they've introduced in their development agreements. So nobody that we know of has actually terminated or found a contract in default over these kinds of issues. So, it would be new ground. The costs would be dependent on, the circumstances. Again, we would bring in Kennedy and Graven on our side to engage the developer and their attorneys in this process. So it would be the legal fees that would be incurred, would be really the costs. The limitations, I've talked to some developers in the process over the past few weeks on this, and they said that they really don't get that involved in the day-to-day operations on the site. That in many cases they wouldn't know who a subcontractor was. I'm working on getting my kitchen redone. There's probably going to be some subcontractor in my kitchen that I don't know who they are. That's why you hire a contractor to bring all those folks in. So it'd be adding something to their process to report to us who every person on the site is. Staff, we wouldn't have the capacity or the expertise really to conduct site visits to determine if there are people on site that aren't on the list or that don't meet the criteria we've laid out. It might set an unrealistic expectation that staff is monitoring, and would there be any, blame's not the right word, but would there be any liability to the city or the HRA saying, listen, you enacted these rules to help prevent labor violations, and yet there was a labor violation occurring on the site that you were overseeing, and would that be put us in any bad light or any legal jeopardy? And I don't think we would ever play an investigation role to say whether a labor violation occurred or not. I think that would still be up to the courts, but we would find out about it then in the process, I think is the way it would work. I will tell you that, when I hear about either people convicted of or being arraigned for or having questionable labor practices, when I hear names, I pass those along to developers with whatever information came to me, saying, well, just to give you a heads up, developer, the city was informed that this particular drywall contractor, there's some questions about their hiring practices or their labor practices, and so if you might want to, if that's somebody on your list, you might want to check into that. So we have been doing a little bit of this already.
Councilmember Supple?
I'm troubled by that first limitation because it seems to be, if you're the developer or the contractor, that's your job to be aware of who your subcontractors and your suppliers are. And I think it's kind of a way to kind of say, oh, I can turn a blind eye and have plausible deniability. It's no, they're responsible for that, and they should be responsible for that. I don't think we should just say, oh yeah, you don't have any control. I mean, they're
paying for that. They should know who their contractors are. So I have a problem with just saying, oh, well, we can't control that.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, council members, my intent wasn't to say that we would excuse that, just that, I don't know, like on a large project, how many hundreds of people, or perhaps thousands of people might be working on the site. For example, all the work being done on the schools over the summer, I went out on a lot of the site inspections there, and the inspectors that I was with were just amazed that every day they saw new faces that they'd never seen prior to that day and would probably never see after that day. And so people come on and off a construction site, and there are just so many people. So what I'm telling you is, what I heard is it's not their current practice to have a complete listing of every person on there. Now, that's the developer. The contractor is another story. The contractor does have that, and should have that, and I would imagine is required to have that. So again, it's just, and maybe that's just a role thing, but it's something, might be a little learning curve for all of us.
Councilmember Whalen.
Yeah, I guess I would echo the same thing, that I think, I recognize that is a change, but I think that's precisely the change that we're hoping developers make. But I guess to clarify, is part of the concern that in some ways we would be punishing the developer for a problem of the contractor?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. We did have a situation, I don't know, it was over the summer, on a redevelopment site where, I can't remember what the type of contractor it was. Was it, I don't know if it's drywall?
I thought it was framing.
Framing, that's right. Well, framing subcontractor who had some past issues and had not yet gone to court over their issues, but that was the next step on another site where they were on a redevelopment construction site, and I had lengthy conversations with the developer. And this is a developer, the Cornerstone Group, that we've done a lot of work with. I do believe they're very conscientious developers. And I think we reported back to you some of the steps that they had taken. And so I think that is a fear that, in this case, it wasn't the developer that was at fault, it was the contractor hiring a subcontractor. And I think it was actually even the subcontractor hiring somebody under them, so it was really far down the food chain. And in this case, if we were to withhold increment, that would hurt the developer. I imagine the developer then would have to go after the contractor and say, we've lost tax increment because of this, and so therefore, developer, you're on the hook for this. And again, this is something untested. Perhaps when a developer sees this language, that would modify the language that they have in their contracts with their contractors.
Yeah. Exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Councilmember Troutman.
I think Director Stark just kind of hit the nail right on the head, that's something that an indemnification clause would sort out, that's a risk and somebody's got to carry that, and a prudent developer will say they're not going to work with a fly-by-night contractor and they're going to be bonded, and if there's liability, they can contract for that risk on the front. But it might be a learning curve for our contractors if we're a city that's kind of putting ourselves out there, that they'd have to be savvy when working in Richfield to be mindful of that, that risk. I did have another quick question for council. Just Director Stark mentioned that there may be some liability for us, perhaps civilly, for creating the statute, not statute, but ordinance. And he thought we may. I just want to give you a chance to speak to that. Do you see any potential civil liability for us for passing this?
Not specifically, I'm trying to remember what John's specific comment was, what the context of that was, but, I mean, I don't see any liability for simply adopting the ordinance and having it on the books.
Yeah, and council members, I think I was talking more almost like on the public relations side
Okay,
than on the legal side of things.
thanks.
Councilmember Whalen?
To the, a couple of thoughts that I think what you were describing of kind of these several tiers of subcontractors hiring subcontractors and no one taking responsibility for that, I think is, again, exactly what we're trying to get at. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is just that in terms of the concern around capacity to enforce it, just want to give a shout out to, I see a union rep in the room from the Carpenters Union. I know they, and I'm sure other unions as well, monitor this kind of stuff already. And so I think, not that we just want to pass the buck on to them to enforce this or to monitor it, but I think that it is still worth, I think it's still worth passing something like this and knowing that, yes, we should do what we can to monitor it ourselves, but we also have partners in the community that work on kind of flagging problems as they arise, and that this would give us additional action that we can take when they do arise. Again, to hold accountable the person who we have the most kind of influence or leverage with, which is always going to be the developer.
Other questions or comments from council? No? Okay, thanks.
Mayor, council members, the next item is the prevention of labor trafficking. And again, with some examples that we have been given, the city just does not have the capacity to really prevent labor trafficking, but there are certain steps that we can take. And as we have seen recently, there is a statewide movement to get engaged. And if you didn't know, recently the city of Minneapolis was selected as 3 cities in the country to lead some of this work around preventing human trafficking, but also labor trafficking. And as we know, we have seen examples of labor trafficking, not necessarily here in the city, but in surrounding cities. And one step that many cities around the country take that is very, very, very easy is simply to have prevention signs. And those signs look like this. We can make sure that they are in the construction zones, that they are in high traffic areas, and we can obviously make sure that it has the information that people may need in some languages. So again, this is an easy way to provide information and simply have this as an access point to anyone who might be currently experiencing labor trafficking.
Councilmember Seppa?
I'm the new liaison to the Human Rights Commission, and I was contacted by them when they saw that we were doing this work session, and they want to offer any support they can give to help counter the human trafficking, like if they can help get the word out, or if there's any efforts that we're doing, they would like to be part of that solution, and they asked me to pass that along.
Thank you, Mayor, Councilmember Supple. I know that I had been having some conversations with the Human Rights Commission and their interest, and one of the research pointed us to having a connected community, and simply making, contacting local county or state authorities when something doesn't look right, especially in some of the high traffic areas.
Councilmember Troutman?
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of words of appreciation and thanks. I just appreciate how we're framing this conversation in terms of human trafficking, because labor trafficking is human trafficking. With regards to the signs, is it just construction businesses, or are there other businesses? I know in years past, we've had trafficking concerns, and they weren't necessarily in businesses that were related to the trades that we would stereotypically think of trafficking. And so I was just wondering how, and I, who knows, but if we would have had signs like that we might have had a channel other than, the tools that we had to disrupt trafficking. So I was just wondering if there isn't a way we could just proliferate that message.
Mayor, Councilmember Troutman, so for example, the one that you see here, it does have, it does cover the different forms of human trafficking, for example, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So that's why I picked this example, because it does cover multiple, and the enforcement and process, bless you, we would need direction as to how that would be enforced.
Madam Mayor and council members, I think in the case of construction sites, it would be our inspections division that would require this. And so we'd have to work out kind of scope and scale. Is this, if someone's doing a remodel on their house, would they have to post signs? Or is there a threshold at which they would? And then again, like on a very big project, how many do you post?
Yep.
So we'd have to work through all those kind of details.
I had a question. So Minneapolis is on this list of 3 cities that have received this funding. So do you know how long ago this was that they received? How new is this?
Mayor, council members, this just happened in the last few months. And they're gonna be receiving funding to have a policy person and support the city's efforts around human trafficking prevention.
So does this mean that this is an area of work at the local level, but really just has not been much policy and work done in general across the country? I mean, the main intervention that we're considering would be signs, right? There's not other forms of enforcement we could use?
Mayor, council members, there's definitely other types, and I can provide some more information on what other cities do to prevent. The signs were simply one way that we can begin right now.
Excellent, thank you. Councilmember Whalen.
Yeah, I think I would appreciate, I think signs are a great step. I think they are just signs, but I think it's worth doing it, but worth exploring more. I wonder, not sure what, how much work this would be and whether it'd be worth it, but I just know, like, OSHA has all sorts of notices that employers are required to post. Would we have authority as a city to say, like, businesses with more than X number of employees, like, need to have a sign like this posted near wherever they post all their other things? Is that something we could consider?
Mayor, Councilmember Whalen, yeah, I mean, we could look into that. I'm not sure about authority to mandate that kind of thing unless it's required by some state or federal law or some other enabling legislation that would give the city the ability to do that. So that's something I'd maybe have to look into. Unless there's some connection between some city project or some other connection with city regulation.
Okay.
I'm not sure that a straight mandate for something like that would be, but that's something we can consider.
Councilmember Sepple?
So I'm looking on here, and it's telling them that they should call the New Jersey Human Trafficking Hotline. Where would we be directing people to call if we're putting these signs up?
Mayor, Councilmember Sepple, so through the research that I did, there are a couple of places. The State Department of Human Rights could be one option, but there's definitely a lot of different tiers of support from the county. And hopefully with this funding that the city of Minneapolis is doing, we could get some light as to what are some examples of things that as a city we could do. And I know that they, as part of that funding, they are going to be doing some partnerships and extensive research as to the local impact, because again, human trafficking is not tied to a specific city boundary. It extends.
City Manager Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mayor. Our research mostly focused on labor trafficking, but we did expand it with the idea of the signs. And when you asked her the question about what is going on locally, there is a connection between human trafficking and transit. And so Met Council and Metro Transit has done some good work in that area, and I can certainly reach out to them and see if they have any suggestions for what the city could do. And we could look at putting the signs at the bus stops.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from council? Okay.
Mayor, council members, just to summarize some of the recommendations. So our first recommendation again is to include a prevailing wage requirement for any project over $300,000. Second is staff recommends redevelopment contractual agreement provisions. Third, staff recommends the use of labor trafficking prevention signs in construction sites and other spaces where labor trafficking may occur. So at this point, we are asking for your approval to implement the first and third recommendation, and also direction to do further research on the feasibility of the second option, which is the redevelopment contractual agreement provision.
Thank you. Comments from council? Councilmember Whalen.
Clarification, for 1 and 3, are they, if we all agree that they're worth doing, is that something that would move forward on a staff level, or are they something that would need like an ordinance that would come back to council?
Councilmember Whalen, I think what we're contemplating is an ordinance that would be brought back to the council for adoption.
For number 1?
Correct. Oh, and for number 3, I guess we hadn't specifically talked about that, but my thought would be that probably wouldn't be in an ordinance form, but that simply would be implemented by staff through informal policy or practice.
Other questions, comments, feedback? Councilmember Sepple.
I do think we should keep looking into the feasibility of the redevelopment contract agreement provisions, and so I'm curious as what do you think the timeline is?
Yes. So I think the form that will take is we bring a number of agreements to the HRA with developers. There's a preliminary development agreement that does not go into this level of detail. We've got some of those coming forward right now, but they spur then the creation of a larger development agreement. I would imagine that we would just include this language in the agreements we send to the developers in the full development agreement, and depending on the feedback from their attorneys, if it goes without any feedback. Usually when we send them a contract, they send us back a redlined version with half the stuff crossed out, and we have to argue with them for several months about the crossouts. So it depends on what they take note of, what they suggest, and then we would bring that back to the HRA saying, we had suggested this language. They said yes, or they said no, but there might be a different way of getting to the same goal. That's how I think this would work.
Councilmember Whalen?
So to clarify, when you say research the feasibility of that idea, that would essentially be by trying it, that we're not, it's not a period of research, come back for more discussion or passing something and then try it?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you. I'll just say it. I know I've asked a couple questions, but I approve or am in support of all three. So.
Excellent. Thank you. Councilmember Trauman?
I want to thank all our staff, our directors, and for Senior Analyst Gavina, who did a lot of work on this, and so I know I'm just mindful of the work and resources, and that we're contemplating more work and more resources. So I just want to say thank you for that, and that I do support this. And in terms of how we might connect number 3 in some kind of ordinance, or something that would be similar to the wage and hour postings, things in the OSHA postings, something like businesses that require licensure. This could be a component of the licensure that, in addition with all the other compliance, they post this right now, and it would be where the wage and hour is posted, and that might be a way to create that nexus between the city and because it's not just any truck that drives through Richfield has to post that, but that might be a way to limit the scope.
Thank you. And in terms of the recommendations, I would be in support of the staff recommendations, and I'd just ask for staff to maybe think about if there's any baseline information that would be helpful, understanding that we're going to be trying things to see how effective they are. You all would be the best to determine what that information would be to look at, to see if it is effective or not for each of the areas once implemented. And then for the third one, it would be nice to have more, I think having the signs, putting the signs up is a good first step, but trying to get, again, a little more information of other things that we could do. And then also, this might be hard data to pull, but if there's any type of data that would give us a sense of what human trafficking looks like in Richfield and in the Twin Cities in general, I don't even know. I just don't know what that is, so that would be helpful. It could be possibly hard to get, but that would be helpful information. And then, again, with the third one, if there's any kind of baseline information to see if what we're implementing is impactful or not. Then second, I also just want to say thank you so much to everybody, to all of our staff who have been working on this. I know everybody has done many different things. I've really appreciated Director Stark's quick responsiveness and connecting with developers when these issues were brought up, and doing the work to communicate and make those connections as these things came up with recent developments, and to Director Asher for doing the work in 2016 and talking to all these other cities and kind of scoping out what the impact would be, and to Blanca and to our attorney and everybody else, and also to the folks in Neighbor who have been working with us. Thank you for attending, but also thank you for just providing the technical assistance and support. And lastly, I would say these type of things I think are extremely important, because I think one of the most important roles of local government is to provide welcoming, inclusive, safe communities for their residents, and these are the type of things that make that happen, as well as being good stewards of our public money and funds, and making sure that as we are developing and growing our city, we are doing that in a responsible way. So I think these kind of things are very much in our wheelhouse, and I thank everyone for contributing to that. So Any last comments? Great.
I just want to make sure that you're comfortable. What I heard is consensus for all three. You've given us several things to do some further research on, including attorney fee provisions, whether we can put signs in, where we can put signs, more information on human trafficking. So we'll get back to you on that, but that is what I heard, so.
Great, thank you. Thanks. And I adjourn this meeting.